Welcome, everybody. As you can tell, we have some music playing for you as you're joining. We'll start in a few moments here. And if anybody's wondering, you're listening to an excerpt from Symphony No. 1 in E minor by Florence Price, the subject of our talk today. Well, I think I can see attendance starting to level off, so I'm gonna try to do a studio fade here. Let's see if this works. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Florence Price Archives, a case study. My name is Greg Stewart, and I am the manager of education programs here at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CHA, as we call it. I use he and they pronouns, and for accessibility's sake, I will say I'm a white person with glasses and dark hair and a white button-down top, and my background is blurred so that you don't see the offices behind me, in case you're wondering. So, and just a little bit about today's talk. The Florence Price Archive makes a fascinating case study in all aspects of preservation and conservation work, and the unique considerations needed for sheet music collections. As a Black woman composing music in the first half of the 20th century, much of Florence Price's contributions to classical music was overlooked until a 2009 accidental discovery of manuscripts that were thought to be lost. So today you're going to hear from Kahng and Joshua Youngblood of the University of Arkansas, where the archive is housed. And they're going to discuss the significance for musicians and researchers, the unique story of its rediscovery, and the work that's done on the archive to make it accessible to researchers, students, musicians, and the broader public. So before we get to the presentations today, just some Zoom housekeeping. You're in Zoom webinar, which means your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. Our program today is auto-closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. We'll have a presentation from our speakers today, followed by Q&A, but please feel free to ask questions anytime during the program, and I'll be reading those questions out verbally at the end to our speakers. And the program is being recorded, and we'll send the recording as well as a PowerPoint and any other resources that we've shared in a follow-up email. So this is the point in the webinar where I would typically say that this program is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. But of course, as some of you may know, with funding cuts to that program, we've had to find some other sources of funding today. But we still want to be able to provide additional high quality educational programs in fulfillment of our mission, as we always have. So we do ask, if you are able to and interested, please consider a donation to the CCHA, or even an institutional membership if that applies to you, if you're coming here on behalf of an institution. And this allows us to continue to keep our webinars free of cost to all. And any little bit helps. So thank you so much. I just wanted to start with that. Just a quick note about the organization that I work for, CCHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based here in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field providing education programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn more about what we do at our website, ccha.org. So a bit more about our speakers today. Urgine Kahng is a violinist, researcher, and educator whose work came to the fore through her advocacy of the American classical composer who we were just listening to, Florence Price. She has been featured on PBS's Great Performance series, Now Hear This, Florence Price and the Great Migration, and her recording of Florence Price's violin concertos, which we were just listening to, has been cited and praised by such sources as The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, and The New York Times as an important contribution to American classical music, and has aired on programs like NPR's Songs We Love and APM's Performance Today. Urgine serves as the concert master with the Fort Smith Symphony, who completed a world premiere Florence Price recording of Symphonies Number 1 and Number 4 in 2019, and the Arkansas Philharmonic Orchestra's concertmaster, where she premiered Florence Price's Violin Concerto Number 2. She is professor of violin and the director of graduate studies at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And Urgine aims to continue the work of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging by exploring the ways contemporary American classical music can intersect with and highlight forgotten narratives of the past, and thus shape the musical values of the past and future. Joshua Youngblood is Associate Dean for Special Collections for the University of Arkansas Libraries, where he has also served as a rare books librarian, curator of the Arkansas Collection, and director of learning and engagement. Before joining Special Collections in 2011, he was a member of the Florida Memory Project of the State Archives of Florida, served as the information officer of the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, and was a staff member of the Florida Main Street and the Bureau of Historic Preservation. He has published on digital archival exhibiting and archival instruction programs, as well as on the history of Arkansas, lynching, and reform movements in the American South. A graduate of Florida State University, Youngblood is a certified archivist and a past president of the Society of Southwest Archivists. So thank you both. I'm gonna stop screen sharing here and turn it over to you. Hold on one second.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you also to the Conservation Center for hosting us today. My name is Urgine Kahng. I use pronouns she, her. I am an East Asian woman wearing a brown turtleneck, and I'm zooming from my home in my living room. The background is slightly blurred for accessibility purposes. I just wanted to provide a brief overview for today's presentation by saying what a delight it was across the last decade or so for me to be involved in this work. It is very rare to be a knowledge worker in higher ed, where much of the knowledge that is produced and discussed makes its way into the public sphere. Much of it kind of remains in an academic realm and highly specialized, and especially with classical music, there's a extremely niche quality to it. So it was delightful and surprising, and I think very impactful and powerful for me, and hopefully for the community at large, to see the impact of this work. Josh and I are hoping to present this Florence Price story in a narrative form. And maybe I'll hand it to you now, Josh, to perhaps talk about the first acquisition in the 70s.
Sure. Yeah, I'll get started with talking about our collections. And for accessibility purposes, this is Joshua Youngblood speaking. I'm a white male, dark-haired, in a scraggly beard, and I'm in my office at the University of Arkansas Libraries, and I have a lot of stuff behind me. One of the reasons I'm in my office is because it shows the breadth of our collecting and the work we do. And so before we get going with the collection, I do want to talk a little bit more about special collections here because I think the context of that makes sense. And I loved what you just said, Urgine, about the being a knowledge worker in these spaces and this type of work. And the special collections at the University of Arkansas Libraries is it's an archives, it's a research institution. It is a print materials holding facility. It also is a vital part of achieving the land grant mission for the university. And the University of Arkansas is a land grant college, and our libraries have, among many other tasks, in working with researchers, working with students, we also have the very important job to preserve the history and culture of the state, and that's the entire state. And so for us, the Florence Price story is part of that, but then it's part of the reach and that kind of public accessibility and how and such an amazing story and amazing contributions of a creative force like Florence Price can go beyond Little Rock, where she was born, to touch the entire world at this point. Our Special Collections was founded in 1967, so we've been going for a long time. And our Florence Price story actually begins almost right at the beginning of our Special Collections. We have here, we're known for having the Fulbright papers in the archives of the Fulbright program internationally. We have lots of political papers, the archives of politicians. And I'm proud to say that between 2014 and 2025, the archive has become our calling card, and the thing we're most well known for, probably among researchers. And the most single-use collection of materials we have is the Florence Price archives. And so that's a point of pride for us, and it's also a very profound point of responsibility for us, something we take very seriously. And I didn't say this earlier, I use he, him pronouns, and whether it's Joshua or Josh, that's fine. So in the questions. Okay, so can we look at the slides? Okay. So right here you see a timeline that begins in 2009. So I'll talk through this timeline first, and then we'll actually go back in time after that. So beginning in 2009, as Greg referred to, and as you might have seen in the New York Times, or if you were to do a Google search on Florence Price, you'd see this story. I like to think of it as an epic tale, partly because we're dropped into the middle, but it has an earlier story. It has a hero who has a tragic fate and all of that, but then she's being celebrated again. It's an amazing story. And from an archives perspective, it speaks to so many aspects of what we do as professionals, but also what we aspire to do. For instance, making such an important collection of materials accessible to anyone around the world. And so we'll get that to the accessibility piece in a little while. So in 2009, the Florence Price, a significant portion of what we now think of as the Florence Price archives and manuscripts was discovered in an abandoned house that had been bought and was going to be refurbished by Daryl and Vicki Gatewood in St. Anne, Illinois. That's outside of Chicago. This house had been, so that's where we are, starting on the left over there with the 2009. That house had been left abandoned. It had been vandalized. It had been open to the elements at different degrees. And so anything that was in that house had been damaged. And that includes this treasure trove of material. So the Gatwoods discovered this material, and then they searched around. And because our special collections had already had some Florence Price materials, they discovered that the University of Arkansas was collecting Price. And so they reached out to us. And so the next date is 2010. And in 2010 is when Tom Dillard, who was the head of our special collections at the time, and Tim Nutt, who is the head of our acquisitions and collecting, were able to work with the Gatwoods, negotiate acquisition, go visit them in St. Anne, to meet the family, talk through the materials, and then plan the move. And what they discovered there was that one thing the Gatwoods had done a tremendous service to us by rehousing the material as best they could, putting it in some new containers and suitcases and boxes, and salvaging as much as they could there. But they also discovered that there was a lot of material damage already. And we'll talk more about that. And I have some pictures to share. And so even though we got this material in 2010, I wasn't quite ready to use. In fact, it would take several years for us to get to the point where we could really open it to the public. And there's multiple reasons for that. There is basic archival practice. It has to be reorganized. There has to be intellectual control. That means we need to know what's in there and where it is. We have to work through issues of description. How are we going to create a finding aid? All that stuff we do. We had to rehouse it, of course. But then there's the issue of the material that's damaged, and then the material that could be ready for users more quickly. So we'll fast forward a little bit to 2014. And so by 2014, we were able to separate most of the damaged material out. And to be honest with you, we weren't sure what we were going to do with some of that damaged material. We suspected significant mold damage. We suspected that there was still live mold there. A lot of it had been, there was rodent and other pest damage. And so some of it weren't sure if it was going to be usable at all down the road. There was significant water damage on a lot of it. And then there's material including records, books, published works, and a lot of manuscript material that could be processed and made available more quickly. So by 2014, an archivist here whose name is Vera Ekachuchu, who as I mentioned earlier with our Fulbright papers, was actually our Fulbright archivist, but we brought her over to this project. And so she began the process of organizing the material that could be accessible sooner, getting that in order. And I want to say here that the faculty here at the university that care so deeply about Florence Price have been involved with this story all along the way. And Erjing has a wonderful relationship with us, and we're so grateful for the work she does. And then back in the 2000s and 2000, after we got the Florence Price material, Barbara Jackson, who at that point was professor emeritus from our School of Music, and Jim Greason, who was still a professor here, helped us immeasurably by, among other things, helping us create an initial inventory, helping us sort material that had been unsorted, helping us decide what should be priorities, what things to digitize and what things were repeats, all those questions that archivists always have to encounter, but we might not have the knowledge base to take on. So also in 2014, we got additional material donated. And so we were able to work with Bridget Robinson, who is the granddaughter of Florence Price, to get additional material. She had had a relationship with us for years, and then when she saw that we got this new treasure trove, she reached out and we were able to get some more. So the collection continued to grow there. By 2015, we were able to release what we call MC 988A, and that is the addendum. So in special collections, we have an MC 988, that's our original Florence Price archive. We have 988A, 988B, which we'll get to in a second. We also have MC 2618, which we acquired from another collector more recently. And then we have a new collection, MC 2676, which was released last year, which is donated by Paul Fortuska. And so I say all that, not that I'm expecting anyone to remember all those numbers, but that we are still collecting Florence Price because that's part of our responsibility, is to have as complete of a collection of her work, or to do our part to make sure her work, whichever archives or repository has it, is bringing in material, making sure it's preserved and accessible. So back to 2015, we were able to release MC 988A. In the months before that, before we released the addendum, word had gotten out already. So we're getting lots of requests by researchers. Researchers really want to get into this material. Word of mouth among musicians and musicologists spreads fast, I came to understand. At this point, I was managing our research services unit and working closely with Jeffrey Stark, who was handling all these requests. And there for a while, it was every day or every week, we're saying, yes, we have some of it available, but not all of it's available yet, and we're working on it. But it became very apparent to the head of our department at that time and our dean of libraries, Carolyn Allen, that we needed to go a little bit more quickly with the processing of the damaged material and to find some way to allow access, if possible, to it. So Jim Greason, I mentioned earlier, who's a professor in the School of Music, he's also creating a documentary at this time, and he was there working with us. And I like to think of it very gentle diplomatic pressure. He applied to us throughout this process. He was an advocate for all the music scholars in the world, saying, okay, can y'all go a little bit faster? So by 2016, we had worked with our Vice Chancellor of Facilities here, who I would love to take the opportunity right now to thank our administration here at the U of A. You don't always get an opportunity to shout out your administrators, but our Vice Chancellor of Facilities was able to help us evaluate, bring in a damage consultant and a danger consultant about the mold. We were able to do an assessment from a safety standpoint. We were able to add some preservation equipment at our offsite storage facility, and then prioritize bringing in some outside expertise to do an assessment and treatment and to help us create a treatment plan. Also, our vice chancellor and our legal counsel helped us develop a waiver. So we put a waiver in place. So as we were doing assessment and initial preservation, we were able to put a waiver in place to allow Jim Greason, but also other scholars to access what we would come to call MC 98B, which is the second addendum. This is the damaged material. So as Rebecca Elder, who we end up working with, is doing the work to stabilize, we are allowing some access. As a public institution, when we get a collection, if it's at all possible to allow what we call unprocessed access or access to unprocessed materials, we will do that. Sometimes you can't do it because the damage is just too great or the disorganization is too great. But we try to do that. And then once full processing is completed, that's our preference, is to get users in there. But because of the scholarly interest, we worked a way to have a waiver in place. So the way this worked was people would contact us. We did not have a published finding aid. We are very proud of our published finding aids here and our public accessibility, but we didn't have a published finding aid for this. Word of mouth had gotten out. So if they reached out to either our dean, our head of our department, or to our reading room, me or Jeffrey Stark at the time, then we would say, okay, here is an initial inventory that we'll send to you. Please don't distribute this yet because we're still in process. So you want misinformation or a loss of intellectual control out there. So then they would make a selection. We would schedule a visit. They'd sign a waiver. We keep a copy of the waiver here on site, and we still have copies of those waivers. And then we will allow access with safety equipment in a closed room. And we did that for a while, for almost a year, until we're able to get a report back on the material being stabilized, have it rehoused, and able to more fully released. So after 2016 and all of that work, complicated as it was and so worthwhile, in 2018, which Eugene will talk about more, we get to see releases of material that was in that 988B, that damaged material treasure trove. The Violin Concerto number 2, when I think back on this timeline and how quickly Florence Price went from being well-known among some people to being worldwide famous, I think of that as kind of a demarcation point, because then we were on the cover of the New York Times. We were getting news broadcasts. It was fantastic. That also meant that our researchers became more frequent. The requests started pouring in, which is great. And so now at my special collections reading room, we host about 1,200 researchers a year. Of those researchers, between 1 and 5 a week are requesting Florence Price material. So that's a significant proportion of our researchers are working with Florence Price. And a lot of those are students. And we do a lot of teaching with our material. And so when we have students from the School of Music come in, if I had them in 2012 and I showed them some Florence Price stuff, they would say, oh, that's really cool. When I bring them in now, their eyes light up and they beam because they are proud of Florence Price being here. And they know it before they even get to us, which is great. But after that initial wave, then Schirmer Publishing negotiates with Price descendants. And so as publications are coming out under the Schirmer Music supervision and approval, there's also that changes our relationship a little bit with our scholars. We have to point them towards Schirmer, of course, and other contacts. We have to update all our finding aids to say, with copyright issues, you have to go to this outside external person. We're able to navigate that. We're also begin digitizing stuff for Schirmer so that they can make publication copies. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we got additional material in 2022. So from 2009, from this initial treasure trove being discovered, through additional accretions of material, through this processing, it goes from being a kind of often used collection to being our most heavily used collection for the last 3 years. So, all right. And we can go to the next slide. And Eugene, if you wanted to add anything, that'd be great. So This slide is called Groundwork Laid Earlier, and I just wanted to mention something I referred to earlier, which is that our work with Florence Price goes almost all the way back to the beginning of our special collections. And this is important to note because the reason the Gatwoods were able to pick us as like a gift from heaven, from the clouds to say, wow, you get this new treasure trove of stuff. It's because we had done the good work of collecting Florence Price already, working with our scholars on campus. We had a publicly available finding aid. So if you Google Florence Price and manuscript or Florence Price and score, we were going to pop up in Google so they could reach out directly to us. So as early as 1974, Mary Hudgens, who is an alum of the university and a librarian in the state of Arkansas, and Barbara Jackson, who I mentioned earlier, were working with Florence Price Robertson, that's the daughter of Florence Price, to bring material here, which we acquired in 1975. We published an initial inventory, but then we continued our work of updating those finding aids. So even before the new stuff came, we updated that finding aid 3 different times. We renamed the collection MC988. Once we got online, we put it up there. It's always been one of our priorities, although it was limited. So that entire collection is about 6 boxes and some images here you're looking at. And what's here, there's a folder open with correspondence between publishers and other scholars that Florence Price was writing to, as well as letters from Barbara Jackson and Mary Hudgens to Florence Price Robertson about additional material. And then the stabilization work, there's another image of photos that were broken that we rehoused, and other pieces of correspondence. Within all of that, there were some manuscript pieces, some professional correspondence, but really not a whole lot in there for researchers, although we did have the one requestable copy of Symphony in E minor, of which Florence Price was awarded the Wanamaker Prize in 1933 and gave her the recognition of being the first African-American woman composer to be performed by a major symphony. We had a working copy of that we could copy and send to schools and other performers. And so we had the requestable copy of Symphony E minor, which you actually added to the collection later after we got the initial donation from Florence Price Robertson. Next slide. And so a little bit more about that 988B collection. So as I said, that the addenda was partially completed for processing in 2015. We worked to have a waiver form in place as well as mitigation for researchers to protect researchers as they came in. The images we're looking at are been labeled actually by Rebecca Elder, who was a professional preservationist, conservation and archivist. And the images are labeled crumpled papers in box. Crumpled papers in box, a second image, and then evidence of mold. And what these are is the material that was clearly, if you see these images, inaccessible. They've been crumpled up completely. There's significant water damage. There's pest damage. The mold image is a little blurry, in part because we didn't want to take it back out of the plastic wrapping. So when we got this material in and we were able to separate out the stuff that had active mold, we had bagged all of that, encapsulated it, and put it into quarantine spaces at an offsite facility. And so when the conservationists came in to work on this, it was still in bags. But if we were to take that image out of that manuscript out of that bag, you'd see purple and pink mold all along the edges. And so there was a lot of damage there. Go to the next slide, please. And so Rebecca Elder, working with a couple of other folks with the firm Gina Minks, did an initial assessment for us, and then they worked on treatment for several months. And so these images are actually from the report they gave us. And so some other images here show jagged edges. That's partly from pest damage, and that's partly just from tear and brittleness. Rusty paper clips, which, drives archivists crazy, but seems like a minor concern given some of the other damage here. Torn, crumpled, and stained pages, and then debris found, and some of that debris was pest waste, as well as decomposing organic matter. Next slide. And so I wanted to talk again about the collecting accessibility. Releasing an addenda to an archive without a published finding aid is not something that we want to do. we err on the side of accessibility at all times here at Special Collections, but like most responsible archives and university research facilities do. And so I have some images here. One shows search results from our overall searching. Anyone anywhere in the world can search our database of archives to get hits. And you see that of an initial search on Florence Price, there's 189 returns. And that includes 7 different archival collections from researchers and from Florence Price herself, and then some other materials in some other places. It's described down to the folder level at this point. It's all requestable if you go down to an item, and each one of these collections has an inventory below it. And so the second image shows part of what we do, and we're updating this language all the time. When we publish a finding aid, that is the overall description of a collection. We keep a biographical note in there. We consider ourselves very proudly to be the repository of record for Florence Price. So we update that information. We also have questions, links, and suggestions for other institutions where we got the archive. We're very transparent about this, that we got it from Daryl and Vicki Gatwood in St. Anne. And then the last image shows just one piece I picked, Tarantella. This happens to be my son, who's a piano player, played a Tarantella recently. So I just picked that one out of the list of possible scores. And once you select it down to that item level, then you can request it, set up an appointment, and anyone can come use our material. And so, Ergine, did you want to talk more about collecting accessibility?
Sure. I think that as a performer, I can maybe contribute to the fruits of your labor, Josh. All of this work in sort of preserving the work allows performers like myself to be able to access the work and to record it, and therefore complete the circle of sort of preservation and composer intent and performer interpretation and performer sort of expression. So I'd like to maybe use Violin Concerto No. 2 as an example. Despite all of the mold damage, once I was able to view the manuscript for the Violin Concerto No. 2, I was quite surprised that there was, it looks relatively clean, as you can see. And so as a performer of classical violinist, I'm very much accustomed to dealing with secondary published materials. You had mentioned sort of Schirmer's acquisition. Many students, many performers will often say, well, where can I purchase this music? And so we often take it for granted that music that is historical is just readily available for purchase, and it's digitized as well, engraved, and not handwritten. And so viewing this was particularly exciting for me. It made something that is often very historical, traditional, and old, fresh and new, despite its age. I wanted to point out something that might be of interest to the audience, which is that despite this clean nature of the manuscript, the orchestra and I immediately found ourselves looking at some questions. So if you look at this orchestral score and you look at the percussion indications, you'll see that there isn't anything written in the margins, but when you scroll to the last measure, it does say celesta or piano. And this, while it is giving 50% of the information, in some ways, as a performer, making interpretive choices with a composer's work who is no longer living can be quite daunting, because who is then the ultimate authority to, and what are the parameters to make a decision for which instrument would be best, especially for a piece that also does not have a performative tradition. And so it was delightful to see how even in the short amount of time, 2018 and beyond, that the recordings and performance of these concertos are really being embraced by performers, allowing for their interpretive ranges to be explored. And so I think this might be an interesting and appropriate time to just segment 2 different recordings, one which has chosen piano, and another that has chosen celesta, and just to see the differences in how this sort of large-scale, heroic, sort of bombastic, symphonic almost concerto takes on a different flavor depending on what instrument is used in the first opening bars. So, Greg, I don't really have a huge a preference for which recording is first. So we get to be surprised. And then the second recording. So even in this small excerpt, I hope to share with the audience just the level of sleuthing and interpretive range, and in some ways unanswered questions that then get posed to the performers. It's been wonderful to live in a day and age of both for digitation and also just a digital community in which many scholars for Florence Price were able to, as you were mentioning, Josh, earlier, post 2018, really enjoy sort of the explosion and the critical mass of conversations, which allow, I think, for a community of artists across the globe to really interrogate some of these questions in a meaningful way that is not just geographically relocated. I do have some other sound excerpts. I'm not sure if now is the best time, but they kind of were I shared them with the idea that it could also show just the range of Florence Price's compositional voice. So this violin concerto, to me, has a very symphonic and large-scale texture. When we first started the webinar, you heard excerpts from the Juba, which is an interesting symphonic texture for me, not only because it showcases sort of early 20th century Americana, but I think the ways in which Florence Price was able to meld what would have, for simplicity's sake, be considered sort of high and low art. She includes slide whistles in this, and I think the overall tone of it is a lot more jocular than some of the more serious symphonies that we might have come to expect. The choice to also program a juba in the third movement of a symphony is also an interesting innovation for symphonic form, because one would expect a minuet or something much more traditional and European as a dance form. Florence Price's choice to include a juba, an African dance of a rhythmic nature, within a European symphonic form, I think in some ways symbolically typifies Florence Price's voice and her efforts, I think, to find something that was both personal and historical, and a way to honor history that is quite complex, especially for a woman like Florence Price. So since we heard a little bit of the Juba, maybe I can share the string quartet, the second movement, which is another example of Florence Price's range. This is an early string quartet. It's the second movement. It's considered unfinished because, again, a string quartet usually would not just have two movements and end with a slow movement. But this particular piece is very special to me because this was the first piece that I was able to physically perform in my hands with students on the campus of University of Arkansas as part of our annual Black Music Symposium, which at that particular year honored Florence Price. And my first impressions of this was just the beauty and the nostalgia of it. I think a lot of musicians sometimes like to overcomplicate things, and there's just a beauty in its simplicity and its nostalgia. So maybe we can just hear a few minutes of this. And that might be a good cadence to stop. And so I'd like to hand it back to you, Josh, by just saying it's been an amazing experience to see this level of collaboration amongst so many invested scholars, researchers, musicians, performers, researchers in making something like this come together. The level of collaboration and I think the level of saturation, when I was speaking earlier about sort of critical mass, has been really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is Joshua speaking again. Yeah, that collaboration is ongoing too, and we it was great to work with you, Eugene, in 2018 so closely. And then we still have people coming all the time, of course, too, which is fantastic. So the slide we're looking at right now is called Sharing as Much as Possible. And and it has some images highlighting kind of what our recommendations from our conservation assessment was in a way, but also kind of how the work just keeps going. So we have the violin concerto number two again here, and it's a simple like day in the archives picture, but this is it in its foldered form, very clean and very accessible with our finding aid information there, which is I think deceivingly simple because it took so long to get here. But also this I pulled this folder because we had a request to do a pop-up exhibit of Florence Price from a funder that works closely with the university. They said, we funded the Scala Cantorum, which is our vocal group here at the university, to do a recording of Florence Price. And we're going to be meeting soon, can you bring Florence Price material? And so I was able to request the material, get it on site, and then bring it out in a folder and show it. And then we're going to have a similar pop-up exhibit where we're sharing Florence Price for the Florence Price International Piano Competition, which will be on campus in a couple of weeks. And so we're doing another table. And so accessibility for us in our outreach, that's great, but also to know that that are aware of it, can see what's there and know that they have the confidence to request it for their own usage. When you're talking about the violin concerto earlier, Gene, I was reminded of research on the piano sonata, which has also seen a wave of performances, very high profile performances in recent years. And in part, as I understand it, and I'm not a professional musician, but as I understand it, because the published scores had mistakes in them. And so scholars have been able to come back to those scores and correct them. And then knowing the archives, as we do here in our special collections, we know that there were fragments of the manuscript available in our first addenda. That's the 988A. And then there are fragments in the 988B, which weren't released until a little bit later. And scholars have been able to come back and performers and look at the different fragments and reconstruct a lot of it intellectually. So now we're getting to the point of it being a more complete performance manuscript, even though some of the published scores out there are not quite accurate. And then the debate is great because people are able to say, wait, we think it's this way, we think it's this way. And we had a piano performer in our reading room just this past year who was saying, oh, I hadn't seen it up close. I just had a research copy. So now I'm here and I'm looking at it. And I think such and such might actually be right about what they were saying. And so they were looking at the score with fresh eyes in real time while they were in our reading room. And so also on this slide is a picture of Florence Price with her daughter. And then this is part of the personal side. So one of the things we have for Florence Price, which we're also able to stabilize, conserve, and then preserve for forever, hopefully, is a lot of her personal material. So we have images of her family going back to the 1860s and 1870s. She had a long history in Arkansas. Her father was a prominent dentist in Little Rock, an African American dentist. Um, who they were a middle class family. They had great connections all over the state. So we have stuff about her history as a person of mixed race and of Black heritage in the state of Arkansas is available here. Her letters to her loved ones and to her friends, her letters to people that she worked on with on libretti and other projects. And then this last image is we took her diary, which is one of my favorite objects to show students, really of any discipline, but particularly music students. This is her diary from 1947 to 1950. We've digitized the whole thing working with our digital collections folks. We also have a research copy available that's been photocopied working with our preservation folks. But if you were to go to digital collections at the University of Arkansas, you can look through her whole diary, which will have notes about such and such piano student that she's working with. And then it'll have fragments for a piece that she's writing, all in her diary. So you can see what the working life of Florence Price was in this time, which is just really amazing to me. Last slide, and then this is where I'll wrap up. And just continued growth and use. And one of my favorite exercises with Florence Price or with anything that we're doing is to just do like a search engine search, see what's out there, and it takes a while to get to us now, which is great. We're showing on the top page, which is good. But so just on this screen is a screen capture of the Great Performances page with music, including images of the manuscripts as they've been preserved as special collections, starting a video right there. And also on there is a picture in our reading room. I believe that might be you or Jean in that picture, doing some research there. And then a BBC page about Florence Price, Forgotten Work by Pioneering Composer Rediscovered. How that story, which as an archivist, I'm very proud about the archivist components to that story, how that's out there still. And then something we have on display right now in our reading room, which is 2 of the 5 children's books that have been written about Florence Price now. Who is Florence Price, which came out in 2021, and then B Breaks Barriers, which just came out this past year. Of course, we worked with the people that wrote these books. The one on the left, Who is Florence Price, was actually completed by students in New York who use our digital collection and then work directly with our archives in order to get images. So it's full of high resolution images within the book. So it's just this wonderful summation of this journey to make all of this material accessible to. And that's where my story ends. I'll actually one little last note to segue us back into getting questions from conservation interested people, which is preparing for this talk. I realized some wear and tear on boxes and folders in our first accession, and so even this week we're working with our preservation department, some of whom were on the call, I think, to refold and rebox yet again. And that's the one I described earlier as having been rehoused and had finding aids redone 3 times already, but because of how heavily it's used and how important it is, we're gonna keep that work going.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you, Urgine. I think this time we can take questions from the audience if anybody has any questions. Okay, so we have one question here. Josh, can you speak more about making the moldy documents available to researchers? How was the waiver worded? What PPE was made available? Was the researcher and materials sequestered from others in the reading room? Yeah, I was wondering that too. That's a really good
Yeah,
question.
and those are good questions. And so I don't have the waiver in front of me, so I don't have the specific language, but it basically is it's waiving liability and that you are entering this into accessing this material at your own risk. I will make clear though that the mold had been we had checked to make sure that the mold was no longer living. So this was at the point where we had already done a quarantine and gotten rid of the mold as best we could, but you could still smell it, and there's still residue from dead mold. So what we did is actually the researchers would use it in a separate facilities, separate room. So we wouldn't have them in the regular reading room. Then we would provide, they had masks, they had gloves, and we actually still provide gloves with some of the aspects of Florence Price. We ask people because some of the material still smells a little bit musty. And so when people ask, we keep gloves at the ready for people using it. Although now all the material can be accessed in the regular reading room. So we would have people in a separate reading room facility that we kept sealed off. So once they signed the waiver, which is basically that you have been advised that this had recent mold damage and there is a risk of mold contamination, and that there is other debris that has not completely been mitigated, something to that effect. And even if I could quote the language, I'd be hesitant to do that because that was written by counsel and I don't have it precisely here. But so they would sign the waiver, keep that on file, and then we would arrange to have someone available with them in a separate room facility. And then the researcher would have gloves and a mask, and then could use one folder at a time, separating it out. So this was a pre-foldering. So this isn't the final foldering of MC988B. So an initial foldering, and then those folders have since been discarded, and we've rehoused it all for its final foldering. So does that answer? Yeah, so sequestered from others in the reading room, actually sequestered to another reading room facility. We're actually making use of two different physical plants. And so at that point, we had an annex that had a quarantine room set up. And then within that offsite storage facility, we had a quarantine room where the work on the manuscripts had taken place. And then we had another room that was sealed off and was only being used by researchers and then staff on site to help them. And so then we had equipment there, and every time there was an iteration of research access, they got new masks and new gloves.
That's really quite incredible, the amount of work you're able to do to make that accessible, even as these works were still being treated for mold.
Yeah,
That's
saying it out
amazing.
loud, it seems like that's a lot. That's a lot that we did.
It's very thorough. Yeah, it's amazing.
And then I said his name earlier, but Professor Jim Greason, who was the person that first got to the material once we had a waiver in place, was also imaging for us as he went. And so he was making his own research images, and then he was filming. And then he has been very generous and shared all those images with us. He's done documentaries on other musicians and composers. So we have those documentaries, of course. But then he would share images with us too. So we could send people preview images like, oh, this is what we have. Do you want to schedule a visit? So great credit to Jim Greason for pushing us, but also for being such a great person to work with on this.
Nice.
And I didn't say her name earlier. I just want to take a moment to say Raylinda
yeah.
Brown as well. So even before we got the new collections, Raylinda Brown and her work on AR editions, and then having a great relationship with Special Collections. Raylinda Brown, of course, passed away several years ago, but she was also a driving force behind us and spread the word about Florence Price the whole time. So.
Thank you. Our next question. Did the musical scores present any specific preservation challenges, or was the preservation process essentially the same for other handwritten manuscripts? To clarify, were there preservation challenges because of the material format? I realized the damage to the scores presented specific challenges.
Yeah, I wish I had more, just more knowledge myself. But I'm a research archivist who now is an administrator, so I can't speak to all that. I can say that there were some scores, and for any musicians or composers other than Regine on the call, I hate to say this, we did destroy some material because it was not useful, and it was very minimal the amount. But we imaged as we went. I said that Dr. Greason was imaging. We were also imaging material too. But the musical scores, there was a lot of water damage. And so I didn't want to share images of the house, but the house that the Gatwoods were rehabilitating was open windows that had been broken through. And so portions of it had been heavily water damaged. And so that was almost unreadable. And with many of the scores still, the water damage has been mitigated as much as possible, but it's still significant in some areas. Now for the paper material, it's very similar in what I've seen in that. So the treatment approaches to the paper were the same as we would have used for other manuscript material. And Rebecca Elder, again, is the one that did most of that hands-on work, although we continue to do that work. But making sure it's flattened, making sure it's dried out, encapsulating what needs to be encapsulated still, using different approaches to our print photographs, of which there's a significant portion in Florence Price. Those print photographs, and this was in the second addenda as well, include tintypes, album prints, glossy prints, all the way every technology you can imagine from the 1850s to the 1950s was there. So that those have different concerns. And then we also had to approach reel-to-reel tapes with different preservation. And the reel-to-reel tapes were not accessible for the most part, although we're still working on some of those. So.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We'll do maybe one last call. But yeah, this was amazing. And I mean, first of all, I just love how it kind of touches on so many of the aspects that we talk about here at CCHA, from inventorying and processing and preservation to the actual treatment of paper to digitization. I love the component of access and how it was really great to have your perspective urging on just what the work that we do in the preservation and conservation side ultimately means for musicians, for scholars, for researchers, for the general public, and how amazing that all of this work is, and how it has such a great benefit to the public. So thank you both for this wonderful talk. And
Thank you.
oh, we have one more question. Maybe if we have one time, maybe we know more about the rehousing, maybe setting, maybe kind of a little bit more, maybe, am I getting that right? Are you asking kind of like what kinds of things were done to rehouse some of the manuscripts and other materials, I think?
Everything in that one
Yeah.
image that I showed shows our approach, which is refoldering all the way through, using musical expertise in order to sort. So we had to do an inventory and kind of marrying pieces together. So that one right there, that works well, although it doesn't have the first addenda 988A has labels on it instead of pencil. But so we use pencil for the rehousing, and I don't want to speak for our processing team, but I would guess that was because of rapidity and also because of us being off-site in order to get this done. So we're trying to have it out there as soon as possible, so we didn't do labeling for them all. But so it still has the pencil data on there. But so each score separated out, and then within boxes, we use a combination of Hollinger's, so half boxes and full Banker's boxes for all of our archives, depending on material type. And then for Florence Price, we also have flat boxes. And so flattening as much as possible with larger format items. They're all in flat boxes. And so on a given day, really any given day, we're going to have Florence Price material out. We'll have a cart that'll have 3 to 4 half-size flat boxes that will have Hollinger boxes with documents, and then we'll have Banker's boxes where the personal material is. Yeah, and so each one refolded. Not all the images have been put in Mylar sleeves. Many of them have, and that's been done on a case-by-case basis. And then our AV material has been treated separately. I will say that we still have some Florence Price material that will never see, so to speak, the light of day. We had a couple of her pianos that were so heavily damaged we couldn't ever make them available to anyone. I mean, not pianos, I'm sorry. That would be even more tragic. I meant her typewriters. We did have a music score typewriter of hers that's not available. Although if you want to see one, we have William Grant Stills, so we do have one on site. But, so there's some stuff that we couldn't salvage.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
Well, yeah. Yes. Carrie says thanks so much as for the kinds of huge amounts of material. Rehousing is not an easy task. Yeah, I'm sure you encountered that.
Yeah, and
Um,
particularly with the different media types and sizes. And I've tried to have some images
mm,
that show the different sizes as well. And our processing team takes a great integrated approach to that. That we'll have multiple sizes of folders, sleeves, boxes, all the way through. And so, and with Price, we get the opportunity to reevaluate all the time because it's so heavily used. We're seeing it every day. So
nice. Um, Well, I think with that, we're just about at time. So thank you so much, Ergene and Josh. I wanted to thank Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes with the tech for and setup for today's webinar. Thank you to everyone. Thanks all for showing up today. And as I mentioned at the beginning, please do consider a donation or purchase of a membership if you're able to. And when this program ends, a little survey is going to pop up after your window closes, and we'd ask that you kindly fill this out to let us know how we're doing. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
thank you. See y'all soon.